Hi and welcome everyone to this webinar today where we're going to talk about capability-driven vendor selection in the finance transformation context. My name is Johan Järresand and I'm a partner at PwC Sweden, responsible for the digital agenda within the finance transformation space. With me here today I have Lars and Lenka who will introduce themselves. But let's start and jump in today's agenda. First, Lars will talk about the future of the finance. Then Lenka will cover capability-driven vendor selection in the context of finance transformation, and we will talk after that about lessons learned from a case study. And if you have any questions, just post them, and then we will answer them during the recording. And if you have any questions afterwards, you can always contact us according to the contact details. Thank you very much. Let's run, and let's start with Lars.
Thank you, Johan. So my name is Lars Johansson, and I work for PwC Finance Strategy and Transformation, and have been working with the CFO's agenda for the last 20 plus years. So future of finance, what is future of finance? Well, let's go through some of the trends that are emerging as we see them and how they will affect the future of finance. First of all, future of finance and the future finance function will work very differently and operate very differently in the future. And the main reason are due to some of the main trends that we see: the rising demand for connected and real-time data, the rising demand or increasing demand for automation, for further digitalization, but also the rise of a sort of new breed of younger accountants who are much more tech savvy than previous generations, but are also more keen to work cross-functional silos and trying to find collaboration both within finance but also together with the business and with IT. So how will that affect finance then? Well, as the way we see it, the future finance, and especially the traditional more transactional accounting services, will significantly decrease in the future. On the other hand, we see a rise and a need and a request also for new types of services that the future finance function will have to provide. So the rope trick here is really for finance to find ways to increase the efficiency within the traditional accounting services in order to have room to invest in new, more business insight related services. And that most of the time starts with focusing on the actual accounting processes, trying to simplify them in order to standardize, but also to automate them. And mostly this is done in addition or in connection to investments in new modern cloud-based ERP system, which also allows the companies to include automatic controls in the processes. So that is sort of the efficiency part of it. So the accounting or finance department is then faced with a choice, either to hand back the resources that have been released through the efficiency or reinvest it into new services more related to business insight. And that is the emergent trend that we see. And we usually say that efficiency drives effectiveness. So if we do things the right way, we will have more time to do the right things. So if we then look at what this will mean for finance, finance will take a very new role, moving from being more of a traditional bookkeeper and moving into being a more business advisory role. So focus going forward for finance will more be having more customer focus, and I'm not only referring to the internal customers and stakeholders within the company, but also the business customers outside the company. There will also be more focus on real-time data, since data will be much more available, not the least through the cloud transformation that many companies are going through. Another task that will be high up on the agenda for a future finance function will be related to data quality, data availability, and visibility, of course. So those are the main trends that we see. So by enforcing efficiencies into the more transactional driven processes, finance will be able to release time and resources and take on a more business advisory role. So this is what we usually refer to as the CFO's agenda. And sometimes we say, well, if you haven't started any of these activities yet, you will probably do that very soon, or you will probably have to look for another job. Of course, you don't need to do everything at the same time. We usually divide this into 3 different sort of transformation pathways. One which we call process-led, the other one is performance, and the third one is people. So if we start our transformation journey in a more incremental fashion, you could actually start with any of these. But remember, in order to do a full transformation, you can't skip any of these pathways. So the people pathway is more related to making sure that we have the right skills, the right people and capabilities within the company. That not only refers to accounting technique skills, but also making sure that we have the necessary digital competence within finance, but also when it comes to collaboration and leadership are important parts of the future finance employee. The second one related to performance, we've covered it somewhat already. It's mainly related to data availability, being able to establish forward-looking predictive analytics and similar capabilities. And then we have processes, which is the pathway where most of the companies start. So it's about making sure that we have simplified our processes as much as we can in order to standardize them, which is a prerequisite most of the time, to increase the automation. And this is often done in connection to selecting and implementing a new a cloud-based ERP system, which both provides further opportunities for automation, but also all sorts of self-service application, which allows the business to provide themselves with some services that the finance department did in the past. So what we then need to consider if we're in a situation where we are considering to change the future position of finance. This is the way we see it. These are 8 different dimensions of finance operating model. The most natural place to start is, of course, with the vision, and making sure that you have a clear vision statement which describes where you want finance to be positioned in connection to the rest of the business, and also what the guiding principles and the necessary capabilities are that you need to have in place in order to live up to that vision. Of course, the vision needs to be aligned with the overall corporate vision and strategy. So questions to consider is, what sort of talent do we need to have? What sort of skills do they need to have in order for us to reach our vision? How do we need to be organized? Where should we locate our different parts of the finance function? What services should we provide, and to whom? To what extent should we try to automate our processes and integrate automatic controls? How should we relate to the finance data models and the connection to the overall corporate data model? Performance management is an important thing as well to consider, not the least when it comes to common definitions of KPIs and providing KPI dashboards to the rest of the organization. And last, but definitely not least, is the technology part, which to some extent is where the biggest investment is done within companies who are actually striving for a full finance transformation. It is related to making sure that we have the right technical architecture in place, but also making sure that we pick the right key systems for finance, which is of course accounting system, but also budget forecasting system, reporting and analytics. So in this context then, the question is, doing a finance transformation, what do we need to consider and what is different when it comes to vendor selection? And perhaps, Lenka, you can tell us a bit more about that.
Yes, thank you, Lars.
Thank you.
I'm going to start by introducing myself. My name is Lenka Stodulkova. I'm part of the technology team here in PwC Sweden. And over the last 10 years, I've been involved in many vendor selection projects. I'm going to follow up on what Lars has been talking about related to the future of finance and trends there, and talk about one important aspect of transformation, which is technology. We have our clients often come to us and ask, well, how can we select our technology in the best way? And this is a complex topic, of course, because the stakes are quite high, both from the investment perspective, as well as the implication towards the organization processes, the impact on customers, as well as employee satisfaction. And this is why we will be talking here about a different way how to select vendors, which we call capability-driven vendor selection. I'm going to start by talking a bit about external internal pressures that we see that determine that we need to reconsider the way how we select technology. We see that there are a lot of pressures that shift the way business technology initiatives are run and implemented, and they challenge the traditional ways of doing things, both from the external perspective, where you have rapid evolution of industry, competition, where digital becomes integrated part of the corporate DNA. You have more complexity in terms of regulations and compliance, as well as we can talk about internal drivers, where business is changing its role in IT projects. We have, of course, increased complexity, increased focus on user experience, and we have also a number of technology drivers where we can talk about the fact that the market is more and more complex, and it's becoming harder and harder to navigate the landscape of the different technology solutions. This, of course, sets up the need for more agility and speed in finding the technology partners. There is expectation that the decisions around technology are going to be taken in days as opposed to months. There is pressure to be more flexible and adaptable as opposed to fixed. There's expectation on establishing partnerships with third-party vendors as opposed to having pure vendor to provide a solution. There's, of course, a pressure to consider more user experience, and the role of business is shifting drastically. Of course, another pressure is around delivering vendor selection processes cheaper and much quicker than it used to be. Traditionally, we have seen that the way of selecting vendors or selecting technology solutions have been in a set of activities that were subsequent in more waterfall manner. This started by defining business objectives, then continued by quite lengthy exercise to gather and document requirements, create RFP documents, issuing that, having vendors spent a couple of weeks to answer to the RFP processes, which followed by quite detailed analysis of the written responses, conducting demos, and that all led to decision a couple of weeks later. This is why we thought that it's necessary to rethink this approach and change it in order to deliver the decision faster, and also considering other benefits around collaboration with vendors. And that is why we are talking now to our clients about capability-driven method for vendor selection, which starts by defining strategic targets and capability agreement. This follows by definition of use cases and then rapid down selection of vendors to shortlist. Then the vendors would share use case demos, and we would start as well with price quotations. These activities would be iterated in collaboration with the vendor to enable the discussions around how the final solution can be shaped and fit towards the capabilities that the clients want to establish in their organization. Now, comparing the traditional and capability-driven vendor selection approach, we see that the traditional approach is much longer from the administrative perspective. It takes more time to establish, for example, the list of requirements. It's quite meeting heavy, very administrative, but at the same time quite safe, because you would have all the details in place at the end of the process. In capability-driven approach, we focus on iterative process. We focus on a number of key deliverables to find the best option. From the coordination perspective, we don't involve large central team as it's been the case in traditional approach, but we focus on light coordination, where we build agile teams around the capabilities, and we involve a number of SMEs that are experts in the market and in the technology. When it comes to requirements, both from the functional and non-functional perspective, the traditional approach has always focused on having quite a detailed list of requirements. Here, in capability-driven approach, we use cases and only few business-critical requirements that focus on critical business aspects, so that it allows to have the room to co-create a solution again with the vendors. From the vendor perspective, when it comes to, for example, due diligence, we would focus on culture fit and product roadmap as opposed to detailed analysis. And the same goes for contracting. Instead of having large and complex long-term contracts, we focus on indicative pricing and establishing flexible, smaller and short-term contracts that focus only on the capabilities that the client wants to establish at the moment, and anything else can be added as a separate contract later on. Now, our clients often ask us, well, what is the capability? How do I define the capability in a good way? Well, this is in the center of our approach. And for us, a capability is what a company needs to be able to execute its strategy. And it really requires a combination of 4 crucial aspects, which is people and skills, organization, technology, and process. Now, the capability-driven approach provides a clarity and alignment on the services and operations that will be enabled and supported by technology. We of course need to say that this approach is not a fit-all solution. So we recommend it typically to companies that are in an environment that frequently changes. We also recommend it to organizations that are ready to change the current way of working, and they want to be inspired by third parties. They want to understand how the future could look like and want to be guided by the vendors. They want to also be challenged and want to co-create the solution together with the experts in the field. We also recommend this to clients that have mature enterprise architecture and have a slightly higher risk appetite. On the other side, if you're in an organization that need to understand fit with very detailed requirements, and that could be perhaps from a regulatory perspective or because you are in an industry that requires very specific solutions and very niche solutions, then perhaps the way to go is more traditional approach. Overall, the benefits from our capability-driven approach is a focus on quick value realization and good start for collaboration, as well as good start for implementation. It creates mutual understanding with the vendor and builds trust in the solution as well as the relationship with the third party. This results in stronger people engagement as well as more focus on user experience, which speeds up the transition and increase user adoption. Last but not least, it leads to cheaper vendor selection process, which limits the need for formal RFP process, and it's less resource and administrative heavy process. Now, what we heard from our clients and also vendors when we did this process was that frequently it can save up to 90% of the investment compared to the traditional tendering process, and it really enables the vendors to create relationship with the client and enable to focus on what is truly important here, to understand the objectives and to understand what capabilities the organization wants to establish and have supported by technology. Now, having said that, I'm going to pass word to Lars again, and he's going to tell you a bit more about lessons learned from other projects that we have done in this space.
Thank you, Lenka. Yes, let me share some lessons learned from a previous engagement we had, which included a full finance transformation. So this was a European company with its headquarters in Stockholm, operating in 5 different European countries. It has grown both organically and through acquisitions, and as we got engaged with this client, they were having 5 different sort of finance functions within the organization, and primarily the consolidation and reporting on group level. The CFO of this company thought that the cost of finance was too high. The time for closing and reporting was not to his satisfaction, and also he had some difficulties related to the actual insights into the financial information. For instance, it was very difficult to understand and get a clear picture of what the profitability was within certain service lines and services. So that was sort of the setup. At that point, the finance function engaged somewhere around 50 people within these 5 different local finance functions. So that was the setup. So the target operating model that we set up for this company was several-fold. One thing was that they really wanted to co-locate those processes that were most suitable to provide economies of scale by being consolidated and co-located into one and the same area. So that was one thing. The second thing was, besides harmonizing the processes, also and establishing a common shared service center, was also through a vendor capability-driven vendor selection process, procure a new common ERP system. So in the past, they have had more or less 5 different ERP or accounting systems, since some of the geographies that the company was present in had been acquired. And in some cases, they had the same software, but on different versions. So going through this process, they ended up with one cloud-based ERP system, which was Workday Finance, which was then implemented as a support both to the shared service center, but also important was to keep some of the business insight function with the local finance. So the previous FDs of this company were appointed as business partners within the 5 geographies. And lessons learned from this assignment. My favorite one is probably the one on the top. Perfect is the enemy of success. And I think this goes very much hand into the capability-driven vendor selection process as well. So instead of detailing your target operating model, since this is a transition process that probably runs over 3 to 5 years' time, it is impossible to know what will happen next year or the year after that. So keeping it to what we sometimes refer to a minimum viable product, but making sure that you establish a baseline and you keep your eye on the target operating model, and then you act in an agile fashion as you move towards that target operating model. That is probably one of the best lessons learned from this case. Define your operating model. We discussed it before. Where do we want to position finance, and what capabilities does finance need to provide the business in the future? Same thing there, sell the vision, make sure that you have an alignment with the rest of the business and that you have people within the finance function with you on this journey, since everyone will be affected. The next point is more related to what we've also discussed before, which is the simplification, the standardization in order to enable automation of the finance processes, or at least the transactional ones. And of course then, if you, as in this case, are implementing new global processes, then the normal procedure is of course to try to establish global template solution. Then there's always a discussion to what extent an initiative where you then implement new global processes with support from a new ERP system should allow for any customizations to live up to local requirements. From a finance perspective, I would say you need to be very forceful when it comes to staying focused on the scope and not, I would say, allow for any other customizations unless they are needed from a statutory perspective, or if there are any local integrations that needs to go into scope in order to support local processes. And the final lessons learned and takeaway here, I think it's obvious to most people, but don't start any initiative like a finance transformation unless you have the right people on board. And the right people is of course both people who are sort of leading the finance transformation agenda, but also the people who are engaged in the program or the projects when it comes to the design and making those both small and large decisions within the vision and the design principles that you've set up at the beginning to make sure that you move forward. And then not the least, the people, our change ambassadors, those people out there, as in this case, the 5 different geographies, who actually understands and sees the benefits of the transformation evolving. So that sort of summarizes the lessons learned from this previous engagement.
Thank you, Lars and Lenka. And I will wrap up now with this slide and sort of try to sort of connect the 2 topics we have covered today, and by presenting sort of a picture of vendors and sort of connected to specific capabilities as well, to sort of connect the dots for sort of the perspectives you have to cover to actually support a full finance transformation as Lars described it, and why it's important, as Lenka presented, to have a methodology for how to do vendor selection through your finance transformation, because there is a lot of capabilities to cover during such a journey. So what we have in this picture is, on one end we have what we call full suite vendors that sort of provide one, but not often one, but many tools. So one vendor is providing many tools, a suite of tools to support sort of the full scope of capabilities required within the finance function. And often you can split that into sort of tools and vendors that provide this for large enterprises, and then you have for small and medium sized companies another type of vendors that is often providing sort of tools that are more suitable for those capabilities. So depending on if you're a really large enterprise, you have sort of some capabilities that a smaller and medium-sized organization doesn't have. On the other end, you have the niche players, And we have, in this slide, split it up in 4 capability areas: financial close, budget and forecasting, group consolidation, BI and analytics. So if you look at the niche side of things, you find specific players that are targeting large enterprises, and at the same as with full suite, you have the ones specializing on small and medium size organizations, which is often more locally represented as well. And I think this picture, what we try to say here is it's a large number of capabilities to cover, and it's going to take a long time before you have covered all those capabilities, and you are going to evaluate, even if you go for a full suite, it is a number of technologies from a vendor that you will have to look into and make those selections. And as Lars was referring to, you shouldn't go for sort of covering all the capabilities in one go. You should do that down the line, which means that in a large enterprise, it's not that you're going to go for one vendor in the end anyway. It's going to be a combination on both sides here. You maybe have a full suite, and then you are sort of combining that with niche vendors covering specific capabilities. There are pros and cons on both sides here, and I think on the full suite you have the advantage that the vendors have sort of taken a process approach. It's a process-driven sort of approach that they have, covering a process sort of from end to end, which makes it much simpler to cover an end-to-end process, but it often very sort of time to consuming to implement. It's more waterfall oriented, and it's not going to be covered by sort of an integrated, fully integrated solution in the end anyway. So you always have to combine that with either niche vendors or other tools from the same vendor providing the suite. The advantages with the niche players is that it's more agile, supporting a more agile approach, often more sort of focusing on usability because it has a capability focus, covering a specific capability, be really good at that, really attracting the customer from that perspective. But the downside is that you will have more sort of challenges integrating these tools with tools from other vendors. So I think this is just to sort of give you an example and sort of see the complexity in the full digital landscape that you have to go through in the digital transformation, and why it's important to have a methodology for how you're going to drive your vendor selection processes during the 3 to 5 year journey that Lars mentioned. And I think we will stop with that. We will share the material afterwards, so you can download the slides. You will also be able to watch the webinar afterwards, and you can share the link and stream the seminar together with your colleagues. And if you have any questions, you can always contact us presenting today, and we will try to respond as soon as possible, either if it concerns your finance transformation agenda or concerns your vendor selection processes or your digital transformation as such. Thank you very much for today, and have a nice day.